Good morning.
Good morning.
We're at Cedar Lodge Baptist Church in Thomasville, North Carolina. It is May 25th, Memorial Day weekend, the last Sunday in May. We are back in the book of Daniel at chapter 6. This is the last chapter in the book that is a narrative style, talking about what's going on in their lives. From chapter 7 on, which we start next week, we get into all the visions and beasts and all the weird things. So you're going to see a radical shift. But remember, always imprint this, the theme of the book of Daniel is the sovereignty of God. Right? No matter what's covered in the topic or the chapter, it's the sovereignty of God. So we're chapter 6 today, picking up verse 1. Darius decided to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, stationed throughout the realm, and over them 3 administrators, including Daniel. These satraps would be accountable to them, so that the king would not be defrauded. Verse 3, Daniel distinguished himself above the administrators and satraps because he had an extraordinary spirit, so the king planned to set him over the whole realm. The administrators and satraps, therefore, kept trying to find a charge against Daniel regarding the kingdom, but they could find no charge or corruption, for he was trustworthy, and no negligence or corruption was found in him. If you're a Bible marker, line it, mark it, underline it. He was trustworthy, and no negligence or corruption was found in him. That tells you these other guys were all negligent and corrupt, right? Then these men said, "We will never find any charge against this Daniel unless we find something against him concerning the laws of God." So the administrators and the satraps went together to the king and said to him, "May King Darius live forever." All the administrators of the kingdom, that's a lie, right off the bat, okay? Because not all of them agreed to this. The prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an edict that for 30 days, anyone who petitions any god or man except you, the king, will be thrown into the lion's den. Therefore, your majesty, establish the edict and sign the document so that as a law of the Medes and Persians, it is irrevocable and cannot be changed. So King Darius, without pausing for a moment to think, signed the written edict. And this is where you and I goof. This is where you and I ruin our lives and other people's lives. Someone says something, and you react, and you respond. You remember what Mom told you before you hit somebody, count to 10? No, actually, before you respond, count to 10, right? He didn't, did he? He didn't. All they're doing is appealing to his foolish pride. All he had to do was stop for a moment and go, wait a minute. All of the guys agree, well, where's Daniel? But see, he didn't do that. This is a huge lesson for you, right here and for me, is when something happens and you're tempted to make an immediate reaction, even if it sounds like a good thing, wait, think about it, pray about it, okay? Verse 10, when Daniel learned that the document had been signed, he went into the house. The windows in his upstairs room opened toward Jerusalem, and 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed and gave thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Mark those words. Just as he had done before. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel petitioning and imploring his God. So they approached the king and asked about his edict. Didn't you sign an edict that for 30 days any person who petitions any god or man except you, the king, will be thrown in the lion's den? You know, the king's probably thinking, yeah, oh, this is going to come back to bite me. The king answered, as a law of the Medes and Persians, the order stands and it's irrevocable. Then they replied to the king, Daniel, one of the, do you see it? This is anti-Semitism all over again, isn't it? One of the Judean exiles. The enemy has always hated the Jews, folks. One of the Judean exiles has ignored you, the king, and the edict you signed, for he prays 3 times a day. Verse 14. As soon as the king heard this, he was very displeased. He set his mind on rescuing Daniel and made every effort until sundown to deliver him. You know, if the king had thought about it, he wouldn't be in this situation, huh? Then these men went together to the king and said to him, you know, your majesty, that it is a law of the Medes and Persians that no edict or ordinance that the king establishes can be changed. So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, may your God, whom you constantly serve, rescue you. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. The king sealed it with his own signet ring and the signet rings of his nobles, so that nothing in regard to Daniel could be changed. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and he could not sleep. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. when he reached the den, he cried out in anguish to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you continuously serve, been able to rescue you from the lions? What do you think he was expecting to hear? Nothing. Then Daniel spoke with the king. May the king live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they haven't harmed me, for I was found innocent before him and also before you, your majesty. I have not done harm. The king was overjoyed and gave the orders to take Daniel out of the den. When Daniel was brought up from the den, he was found to be unharmed, for he trusted in his God. The king then gave the command that those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and thrown into the lion's den. They, their children, and their wives. They had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Verse 25. Then King Darius wrote to those of every people, nation, and language who live on the whole earth, may your prosperity abound. I issue a decree that in all my royal dominion people must tremble in fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed, and his dominion has no end. He rescues and delivers. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth, for he has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius, even the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Let's pray. Father, it's so easy to get caught up in that whole lions and thing to miss the whole point of this. So help us to kind of release the Sunday school lessons and the flannel graphs and the things that we thought we've learned about this and understand why this chapter is in our Bible. Help us to realize that you are sovereign, no matter what the odds or the consequences may be. We thank you for this truth in Jesus' name. Amen. Grab your notes, you're going to want them. At the end of the Lord's Prayer, I notice I titled this, God Delivers Us from Evil. At the end of the Lord's Prayer, when Jesus was teaching his disciples how to pray, he wrapped it up with, and do not bring us into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Matthew 6:13. Jesus knows that his disciples have a tendency to stray into various kinds of temptations, many of which are traps set by the devil himself, by the evil one, Satan. But there are occasions in the life of a believer when evil people plot to do us harm, simply because they hate goodness, and they hate righteousness, they hate holiness, and they hate God. Right? It is times like that when we have to do what Daniel did. He trusted in God. We have to trust God to do what is right and pray for him to deliver us from evil. That's the situation Daniel found himself in chapter 6. Now, a point of contention here, this is another one of those ones where a dude's name shows up that doesn't show up anywhere else, right? Remember the handwriting on the wall back in chapter 5, right? Belshazzar has got all of the stuff from the temple and they're drinking and everything. His hand comes out and starts writing Mene, Mene, Tekel, Perez, right? Or Parson, right? Daniel interpreted that last word, Perez, as meaning, quote, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Okay? So according to Daniel 5:31, Darius the Mede was 62 years old when he conquered Babylon. That's this Darius right here. The Medes dominated the Persians until Cyrus the Great conquered the Medes in 559 BC, 20 years earlier. He gave Medes and Persians equal power, so that foreigners often spoke of the kingdom as the Persians and the Medes, Esther 1:19, or the Medes and the Persians, Daniel 5:28. Okay? We know from history that Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon in 539 BC. So this is the guy we're talking about. By the way, that empire became what we know as Iran. It's the Persian Empire. So the question then is, who is this Darius the Mede? Because as we go through the later chapters, you're going to see name changes here. Most likely, Darius the Mede is the conqueror's name, the conquering general, among the Medes and the Persians that came in and conquered Babylon. Among the Medes, he was called Darius, and among the Persians, he was called Cyrus. Okay? Two different names, like Pharaoh had different names as well. Okay? So we can translate what I did in chapter 6, verse 28. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius. You have that word and right there. That can be translated even, or that is. So you could say, Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius, even the reign of Cyrus the Persian, or that is Cyrus the Persian. It's the same dude. Okay? That's why people get confused about this. So, though it's often overlooked in the excitement of the story, everybody's through the lions, right? The theme of the 6th chapter of Daniel is one of faith and prayer. Daniel's established prayer life is the central part of this story, as is his faith. And we get a little bonus thrown in there, the apparent conversion of Darius, much like we saw the apparent conversion of Nebuchadnezzar earlier. An important point here is that Daniel didn't suddenly become a man of prayer, reacting to the circumstances brought to bear upon him. This was his normal way of life. Right? Neither was Daniel's pattern of prayer 3 times a day, face toward Jerusalem. That wasn't prescribed by the law. See, these guys don't understand this at all. They think they're going to trap him up in things regarding the law of his God, verse 5. There's nothing in the law that says you have to pray 3 times a day. Now, there are religions that have things like that. You know, if you have to pray 5 times a day toward that kind of thing. But that's not in Judaism, and it's not in Christianity. You're not prescribed to pray so many times a day. Whatever you decide how you're going to pray, how often you pray and stuff, that's between you and God. The Apostle Paul says you should basically pray all the time. Your life should just be riddled with prayer all the time. Okay? So they got this wrong. It wasn't a matter of law. Neither did Daniel attempt to hide his religion or his religious practices. His enemies knew he was a man of prayer, so that's where they attacked him. You know, as a Christian, I've always had difficulty with people who like to live their lives according to rules. You know, Robert's Rules of Order or whatever it is, right? Rules, etc. And who try to impose those rules with strict adherence on other people. It always reminds me when I hear about that of this stuff right here. The law of the Medes and the Persians, which does not change, or which cannot be altered, or which is irrevocable. It's like, here's the reality. Timeless truth. Only God's decrees are perfect. Man's rules are almost always flawed at some point because flawed men make them. Okay? When someone says, this is the rule I live my life by, that's what you got to do, man. Yeah? When the teacher guy comes to Jesus and says, Master, you know, sum up the whole Testament, right? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbors yourself. Do you hear a bunch of rules there? When you become a Christian, you get baptized, right? In obedience, we have communion. Those are the two ordinances of the church. I see people involved in these religions where they're praying down strings of beads, doing all this other stuff. It's like, that's not what God wants. He wants a relationship with us, not a bunch of rules. Now, this chapter also shows us how corrupt people hate incorruption. During Daniel's life, there was much corruption in the government. As we read this, I get the impression that all the other satraps and administrators were corrupt. They hated Daniel. Why did they hate him? Because he wasn't corrupt. Okay? Lord Acton wrote ages ago, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Not much has changed over the centuries. While I was prepping for this, I was looking for examples of corruption in government. It's so hard to find these days. So, a guy who studies this stuff posted this, and it's far enough back I thought I could be safe with this. 1987 and 1988, 2 years. 87, 88, before some of you people were born, right? 1987 and 88. A study of the corruption in the United States Congress. These are facts, not accusations. You ready? 29 congressmen had been arrested for spousal abuse. 7 were convicted of fraud. 19 were arrested for writing bad checks. 117 had bankrupted 2 or more businesses. 14 were arrested on drug charges. 8 were arrested on shoplifting charges. 21 had lawsuits filed against them that they lost. 84 were charged with driving while intoxicated. And I thought, wow, what wonderful examples of godly leadership that group was, or not. You know, from what I've seen, recently it would appear that corruption in our government has reached mind-blowing levels compared to that. And the reason that so many people are fighting so hard against having that corruption exposed is that it has become their livelihood. Corrupt people hate incorrupt people. That's the problem right here, right? The king says, I got one dude, one guy I can totally trust. Go back and look at it. There were satraps accountable to them so the king would not be defrauded. Verse 3, Daniel distinguished himself above the administrators and satraps because he had an extraordinary spirit, so the king planned to set him over the whole realm. So here's your problem. Darius is looking at all this mess that he's taken over, right? He's got all these leaders, and he's realizing it still isn't working. But that dude, I can trust him. So we're going to make him over all the others. And all the others who are corrupt are like, no, you're not. We're going to take him out. We're going to make him unalive, right? He's gone. We're going to do whatever we got to do. Okay, how do we do it? And that's what the chunk of this chapter is about, right? Darius made it known that he was going to place Daniel over the kingdom. He wanted someone who had no negligence or corruption found in him. So they figure out, we've got to figure a way to get rid of him, and that's when they come up with their plan. Notice in verse 7, I pointed out a moment ago that the men lied while promoting their plan. All the governors, the moment you hear someone say all, right? Man, red flag. You know, are you all? Okay, well, can I talk to everybody and they will all agree on this? No. All of them had not been consulted with. This was a trap set specifically for one man, for Daniel, who was well known for his integrity. That made him an easy target. His enemies who were guilty of the sin of envy thought that if they could control the circumstances, create this law, 30 days, right, that they could control the outcome. They just left one thing out of the equation: God. And see, when the world is scheming against you and things aren't working right, maybe it's tough at work, you know, and it seems like the boss and your coworkers, they're just hammering on you and stuff. Remember something, folks. God, He's still there. He's still sovereign. You might be saying, everyone is against me. No, everyone is not against you. God is not against you, is He? I mean, think about what the songs we just sang. How great is our God? How great is your God? Is He greater than all your enemies? Well, yeah. Okay? They just hadn't figured God into the equation. So, you have to wonder, why did they want Darius to issue this law in the first place? Right? What did it mean for Darius to issue a law forbidding anyone to pray to any other god or any man except him? If I'm king, I'm going to say, no way, I don't want everybody pestering me with all their garbage. Do you remember Moses and the people coming out of Egypt? He's trying to do all the things, and his father-in-law says, guy, appoint some judges over this mess, you know? You can't. So they're trying to tell him, king, we want you to do everything. If he had a lick of sense, he would have said, that's a dumb idea. But the answer here is really obvious. They wanted him to put himself in the place of God. Now, unwittingly perhaps, but nevertheless doing so, he did it. By signing the edict, he's in effect saying, I am the one to whom all people should look for all things. I am sovereign. I mean, after all, government can take care of all of our needs, right?
No.
Yeah. Cradle to grave, I think it was, right? This is similar to the sin that King Belshazzar had in the desecration of the temple vessels. And this is very similar to King Nebuchadnezzar, right? Standing on the walls. Is this not great Babylon that I have built? And God says, go. Right? Yeah. And it wasn't greatest of all time. So, it's a sin of blasphemy. It's assuming God's place. Right? Remember, the overarching theme of Daniel is the sovereignty of God. But the sin of putting self in God's place is the sin of every secular culture. We see it in Babylon, we see it in the kingdom of Rome that Daniel will prophesy about later on in the following chapters. When the age of the beginning of the church, they had to deal with this. And this was the kingdom or the cult of the Caesars. Right? In Rome, in the Roman Empire, you could worship any god you wanted as long as you also gave allegiance to Caesar, right? And the phrase when they would ask you, you remember, you see the World War II movies where the Germans come together and they go, Heil Hitler, right? Hopefully that's not you know, they do that. So in Rome, it was Kyrios Caesar. Caesar is Lord. So you would say Kyrios Caesar, right? And so the Christians, they had a problem with this because there's only one Lord, right? So they'd say, well, you can practice your Christianity, but you must say Caesar is Lord. The Christians said, I can't do that. Yep. Now, it isn't that they forbid the Christians from worshiping God. They could worship God. They could have their little prayer meetings and their sings and have their church services, but they had to acknowledge Caesar. Otherwise, they weren't being tolerant of the cult of the Caesars, which was the power of the time. So when Christians denied Caesar the allegiance that they believed belonged to God only, they were executed, right? One of the ways they liked to execute them was to toss them to the lions. Yeah, I mean, history just repeats itself, right? So you have to wonder, is it any different today? It seems like if we practice our religion in private, if we don't attempt to bring it out in the public square, the world tolerates us. You know, just go do your thing and leave us alone, right? But if you're determined to take a stand on any important issue on the basis of biblical teaching, right, you will experience the fury of secular society. Our current, I believe, is vice president and maybe the Department of Defense guy, have a Bible study prayer meeting weekly they're doing up there in D.C., and one of them opened up and praised Jesus as King and read from the Bible. And the press just went ballistic. Now, someone can come in there and say, oh, Allah is great. And that's fine, but the moment they said Jesus, they went nuts. It's the same basic thing. Corrupt people hate incorrupt people. And I'm not saying any of the politicians are incorrupt. But the moment you say Jesus says, you are now the enemy of the state. Now, why a lion's den? In case you're wondering here, it's like, wait a minute, just a couple chapters earlier, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego got a trip to the furnace, right? In the fire you go, right? Why not a fiery furnace? Obviously the thing was still around, I would think, Why a lion's den instead? Well, every religion has its own oddities and weirdnesses. And the Persians and the Medes didn't think using fire, which they held to be sacred, as the proper way to incinerate or cremate people. But feeding them to lions is okay. Okay? And the other thing that comes up sometimes in studying this, as Daniel's entering the lion's den, right? The king says he's got to go in. They're putting Daniel, and they're not lowering him by a rope. I think he kind of walked down this thing, and they roll the rock across, right? As Daniel goes in the lion's den, you think, well, wait a minute. Daniel would have entered the lion's den with the assurance that God was going to spare his life. No, he wouldn't. Do you remember before Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego went in the fiery furnace? You remember what they told the king? God can spare our life, and he may choose to do so. But even if he doesn't, we're not going to worship your idol. See, as a believer, you got to be careful about this. Oh, God's going to spare me. Because lots and lots and lots of believers over the centuries have been martyred for their faith. So as Daniel was going down in the lion's den, there's no assurance that he's going to be walking back out again. Because you've missed this maybe in Sunday school. You always have pictures of Daniel as a boy or a young man. Daniel would have been in his mid-80s at this point. Okay? He's not a kid. He's been through 4 kings. I mean, he's been around for a while. So Daniel may be thinking, well, I guess my ministry is over. It's time to go meet God, right? What Daniel needed in the lion's den was unwavering faith, trust in God, regardless of the circumstances. And that's what you and I need every day. We may never be cast into a fiery furnace. We may never be sent into a lion's den. But reality, there will come points in every believer's life where all of a sudden hard decisions have to be made. And you're looking at this going, man, rock, hard place. And that's where, okay, God, I'm trusting you. I don't know what I'm supposed to do here, but I'm just going to trust you. Daniel went into the lion's den trusting God. Now, we know the end of the story. He makes it okay. Darius then is so impacted by Daniel's faith that he actually honors God as sovereign. This is just so awesome. He sees God's faithfulness to his servant, and he expresses something here that is kind of like what Nebuchadnezzar wrote back in chapter 4, right? Look at the words of this decree. They're so beautiful. Verse 26. I issue a decree that in all my royal domain, people must tremble in fear before the God of Daniel. Now look at these words. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed, and his dominion has no end. He rescues and delivers. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth, for he has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. That last bit, for he has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. Well, that we know, right? But when you read that, I know you've read this before, right? You've all read this before, right? See your hands. You've all read this chapter before, right? Where did the rest of that information come from? That's not in this chapter. You know what? The king couldn't sleep. He fasted. No diversion was brought to him. When you're bored, what do? Well, he didn't have a TV set. He didn't have the internet. But he had the scrolls of the previous kings. I think he read. And like, wow, Daniel worships. This is the same Daniel of Nebuchadnezzar. This is the same Daniel of Belshazzar. Oh, good grief, I'm messing with the wrong guy here. My guys just tricked me into touching God's servant. When he writes this, he rescues, he delivers, he performs signs and wonders. It's like, this is a life change. This is, wow. I think Darius got it. In saying all this, he says, I am not the Most High Sovereign, but God is. He is the living God. He endures forever. His dominion has no end. This is the king of Babylon saying that. Daniel's faithfulness, even in his old age, exemplifies the evangelistic potency of a godly, uncompromising life. Matthew 5:13-16. You are the light of the world. You are the salt, right? Our lives, how we live them, should be evangelistic, right till the day we die. Say, well, I'm old now. And your excuse is that? Daniel estimates are 84, 85 years old. And I'm pretty sure they didn't have walkers back then, so he just had to do it, right? So, what about us? If we were faced with a decree not to worship God or to pray for him for 30 days, what would we do? Yeah, you all lived through 2020 and 2021 and 2022 and part of 2023 when things started to turn around. We worshiped. You know, I ride a motorcycle. You all know Terry and I love to ride the bike. Perry and I went riding yesterday. Every time we go for a ride, and I saw it started happening in 2021 and 2022, riding all the beautiful back roads in North Carolina, closed churches, empty buildings, congregations gone. Pastors had to go work somewhere because the congregation folded. Why? Because a decree had been issued. But it's not the same thing. Oh, it most certainly was. And the vast majority of people caved. The vast majority of Christians caved. The vast majority of churches closed. And some of them never reopened, or reopened at 25% of their previous size. See, I think we have the answer to the question, what would we do? If you don't already have an established pattern of devotion to God, going 30 days without worship or prayer isn't the big thing, is it? You know, a lot of people would probably say, well, hey, 30 days, man, that's not too bad. Was it 2 weeks to slow the spread? 30 days, that's not too bad. It isn't like we have to bow down to an idol or anything. You know, it's not like we're being threatened with furnace or lights. And we're just told that we have to stop praying openly for 1 month. And, you know, we can be subtle about it. We could close our curtains and hide. We could just pray in bed at night, right? Or, hey, you know, I don't want, maybe my TV and my phone are spying on me, so I tell you what, I'm just going to let my devotion slide for a month. I mean, it's only a month, right? After all, some people probably allow a month or more to slide by without any significant devotions. Ouch. I don't want to show hands. And obviously online you can't show your hands. But how often is it that you go out to a restaurant somewhere and you get your food and you sit down and you just start eating and you don't stop to pray? Because you might feel embarrassed as other people look at you. How often is your day so busy that you get up, you know, you go to the bathroom, throw on your clothes, rush out the door, and you haven't touched your Bible or prayed. You haven't acknowledged God for the fact that you woke up this morning. What is your devotional life really like? See, when the flame gets turned up, when things get tough, if you don't have an established relationship with God, trying to start one then is really hard. Some people just, 30 days, no big deal, but not Daniel. Look at verse 10 again. When Daniel learned that the document had been signed, he went into his house. The windows in its upstairs room opened toward Jerusalem, and 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed and gave thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Those words are highlighted in yellow in my Bible. I love those words. That was Daniel's pattern. The outside world may be changing, but God hadn't changed. And Daniel wasn't going to allow his relationship to God to change regardless of shifting circumstances. And I want you to see 2 things about Daniel at this point. First, Daniel was the smallest of all possible minorities at this time. He was a minority of 1. Now, this is not saying there weren't other Jews in Babylon. There were. But in the leadership, right, in the powers, he was 1. There was 1 believer. 1 in all of these. That's why they're all trying to get rid of him. 1. Only 1 man standing against hostile enemies. He was the one man who knew the true state of affairs in the struggle. You see, Darius, he got duped. He really didn't know what was going on. He wasn't even able to see through the subterfuge of the administrators and satraps. He perceived nothing of the spiritual struggle until after the fact. I think it was that night of fasting that God got through to him. The conspirators here, they didn't understand the situation at all. They thought Daniel was a legalist, that he prays because God commands him to. No. They didn't know Daniel's God. They didn't know Daniel's faith. And they thought it would be an easy thing to get Daniel executed. When I say it was minority one, I want you to really think about that. Because what you don't read in this chapter is that Daniel had the support of his 3 friends. You know, there's only 2 possibilities here. One, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were transferred to other parts of the empire. Babylonian Empire is huge, right? Or the more realistic one is they're dead. They're dead. He's in his 80s. So these guys are his age or older, right? They're dead. He's all alone. It's just him, right? He's the last man standing in any kind of leadership position in the entire empire of Babylon. You know, and those of us who have more years behind us than ahead of us know the pain of watching our friends and loved ones pass away. And, you know, people you've known and been around your whole life, and they're just not there anymore. That's why we must always be faithful to share the good news of the gospel of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection with those we love. Because one day they're not going to be able to hear it anymore. Daniel is now elderly. He's the one man standing alone in the midst of an utterly pagan culture. Everyone is against him. Yet in all this vast empire, Daniel is the one man who really had it all together. He knew there was a true God, and he knew who the true God was. He knew that God was powerful. He knew that God could deliver him if he chose to do so. Above all, he knew that obeying and serving God had to be the supreme goal of his life, even if it meant his death. That's the first thing. Don't ever complain you're all alone. You sound like a fool when you do that. Do you remember a prophet in a cave? I alone am left of all the followers. And God says there's 3,000 who've not bowed the knee to Baal. You're not unique, right? In Daniel's case, he doesn't cry out, God, I'm the only one. He just says, okay, God, whatever. Yeah, I'm just going to trust you. Now, this leads to the second important thing about Daniel. And again, this applies to you and me. What he knew, he practiced openly. You know, some people try to keep their belief in God a private matter. They only talk about God if somebody asks. They say, well, I don't want to be pushy, man. I don't want to offend anyone. I don't want to be seen as religious. So they back off. They retreat. They privatize their convictions. I look around at the world today, and people who hold really weird views of things, they ain't private at all. You know? When the bright blue-haired person with metal all over their face and stuff, and the rainbow shirt comes walking up to me, I know exactly what they believe. They're in your face with it, right? When the Planned Parenthood shirt person comes up, I know what they believe, you know? When the dude with all the Harley Davidson stuff on, I know what his thing is, right? But for some reason, Christians are like, well, I don't want to offend anybody. Daniel didn't live like that. This shows the greatness of his faith. Instead of hiding his convictions, he knelt before his window in the sight of Babylon and prayed just as he had done before. He didn't, okay, there's now a decree, now I'm going to get serious. No. Daniel had been doing this for, well, let's see, he was taken captive at the age of 13, 14, 15, somewhere in there. If he's 84, that's 7 years. It was just, they all knew that. You know, there's Daniel's legs, yep, he's praying. Now, it's not to be showy, it's the fact that I worship the true God, I know who he is, and if you're curious, I'll tell you. He never hid it. He spoke to kings about it. See, the world needs more Daniels. More people who are willing to honor God publicly before watching the world. When we first started the series, Terry sang a song called Dare to be a Daniel. Remember that? Dare to be a Daniel, dare to stand alone. You're not alone. Right here in this room, there's a whole bunch of us, right? We have thousands of people every week who watch these sermons and share them with their friends. You're not alone. But are you public with your faith? Jesus said some really cutting words. I didn't put the reference in your notes. I'm sorry. You can write it down. It's Matthew 10, 32 and 33. Because I think it kind of sums this up. Matthew 10, 32 and 33. In the middle of a discussion, Jesus says, "Therefore, everyone who will acknowledge me before others, I will also acknowledge him before my Father in heaven. But whoever denies me before others, I will also deny him before my Father in heaven." See, I think it's time for God's people to live openly and publicly for Jesus. The enemy's people live openly and publicly for him. Kill the babies, pervert sex, mutilate the children, destroy worlds, yay, And Christians are just like, it's time to Daniel up. It's time to say, what are they going to do? Kill me? That's a promotion. Dare to be a Daniel. Live with that thought in your heart this week. Pray with me, please. Father, I can't even imagine what living all those years in Babylon must have been like. Separated from his homeland, separated from his family. His 3 friends eventually scattered throughout the area, and by this point, most likely dead. And now in his, quote, golden years, in his 80s, just trying to carry out his job. The king gives him new things to do. And all the other guys hate him. Because he wasn't corrupt and he wasn't negligent. May that be said of us, Father. May people talk about us, say, you know what? She's not corrupt. She's not a bad person. She doesn't lie. She doesn't cheat. She doesn't steal. She's trustworthy. She's honest. She loves God. He's a noble man. I would trust my children in his care. He loves God. That's what we want to hear, Lord. Help us to dare to be a Daniel. To live publicly the faith that we have in Jesus Christ, who died publicly in our place, who was tortured and crucified, a horrible death, who had our sin debt poured out on him so that we could be forgiven, who was buried and considered to be a criminal, and yet resurrected as the Lord of glory, King of kings, Lord of lords. Father, I pray that you would give us the boldness to live with that faith, that we would dare to be a Daniel. We're not a minority of one. There are a lot of other believers in this world still. And as a faith family here at Cedar Lodge, we lift each other up in prayer. We support each other. We cry for each other. We rejoice with each other. Father, may we always be what you've called us to be. And may we share what we know with a lost and dying world that needs the truth that we have. And may we do it all in Jesus' mighty name. And all God's people said,
Amen.